Welcome everybody, we're talking about psychoanalysis and what made psychoanalysis or Freudian psychology such a big deal in the world of psychology. Now, this isn't going to be so much about the semantics, about certain principles and a deep dive into all the little things. This is going to be more focused on the surface level, the ideas, and at the time when this was introduced, why this was so influential. In my opinion, one of the, if not the most influential theories in all of psychology ever. I'll tell you why. It's very, very simple to understand this. What if I told you I had a friend who felt very nauseous? When she spoke, she stuttered. She spoke very, very fast. She kept fidgeting with her fingers, and her heart rate was really high. She goes to the doctor, comes back, and all of her symptoms are gone. She's been cured, quote unquote. Now, what would you think if I told you that this happened without the use of any medication, any injections, any scans, any of that stuff, and simply by talking? Now, it's 2023, you're listening to this, you're going, well, wow, Daniel, what an insightful thing to say, as I say in a sarcastic manner. We all know what anxiety looks like, and it can manifest itself in physiological symptoms. People who feel very anxious are going to feel nauseous, they're going to feel lightheaded, they're going to speak at a faster rate than a normal person would. They might be a little jumpy. So it makes sense that they go to a doctor, or maybe they do some counseling, and their symptoms decrease, right? Now, what if I told you this happened 123 years ago? Over a century ago, over 120 years ago, a medical doctor by the name of Sigmund Freud started doing this. Now, folks, I want you to think about how far away 120 years ago is. Because when I say right now that it's obvious that we know what the symptoms of anxiety are, and that talking about it, that breathing about it can decrease those symptoms, 120 years ago, who the hell was saying this stuff? When you had a doctor, a medical doctor by the name of Freud, who recognized that his patients didn't need to be medicated in order to decrease their symptoms. But he could simply do so by talking to them. Like, oh, what makes you feel upset? Tell me about that. What do you feel as you express that thought? Do you know what to do? Like, as he's doing that stuff, literally people start to feel better. And this was so unbelievable and so revolutionary that the papers at the time had written, you can Google this true story, they said, Dr. Freud has discovered the talking cure. It was so unbelievable because people would walk in with very real symptoms and they would walk out with the symptoms alleviated. So imagine the year is like 1898 and the majority of his patients were also women. Your girlfriend goes over to see her medical doctor, comes home and she feels totally fine. And as she's trying to explain to her husband or brother or boyfriend or father what happened, she's like, yeah, but we just talked. And everyone's like, but I don't understand. You looked like you were sick. We thought you had the flu. We thought you were coming down with something. We talk. I'm your father. I talked to you. Your brothers talked to you. What did he say? Was it some witchcraft? And this idea, folks, is crazy. 120 years ago. This is before women could vote. This is before World War I. Hitler was in his mom's house still trying to be an artist, while Freud was coming up with the talking cure. In order to do something new, in order to reinvent the wheel, if someone goes out of their way and they're a little bit wild, we do one of two things. If it turns out that there's some method to the madness, if it turns out they're right or something beneficial comes out of it, we call them geniuses, right? We call them creative. We call them, what a visionary. If it turns out they're wrong, we call them crazy. Oh, he went this way when everybody went that way. He's crazy. So is he genius or is he crazy? Maybe a little bit of both. So what Freud recognized back then was you don't need medication in order to feel better, in order to alleviate your symptoms. Here's psychoanalysis in a nutshell. Ready? Whenever someone hears, oh, I saw a psychoanalyst, psychoanalyzing me and that stuff, here's what it means. Freud believed that many of his patients, not that he believed, his anecdotal evidence was this. A lot of the women that visited him talked to him about instances or events that happened many years prior. So a 30-year-old woman would talk about something terrible that happened to her when she was 18. And Freud's sitting there going, my God, it's been 12 years. And yet when you talk about it, it makes you cry. Like, how can this be? This isn't something that happened yesterday or last week. This is 12 years ago. And a bunch of bad things happen to everybody. But every once in a while, something comes along. And it's so crippling and it's so debilitating, it's like it latches onto you. And you carry it with you. And what he discovered was that a lot of people, when they were younger, when they went through traumatic events, when they went through abusive relationships, things that cause depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, very much childlike. When the child doesn't want to see the monster, what does the child do? They go under the covers, right? Because if I don't see you, that means you don't see me and you don't actually exist. And what Freud recognized was that we blind ourselves to our problems. And when we blind ourselves, we alleviate the pain temporarily. I am in an abusive relationship. When my boyfriend starts yelling and throwing things and shouting, I'm going to go into another room and turn up the music. Because if I don't see him, I alleviate the emotions and the thoughts of I'm in an abusive relationship. Freud believed that a lot of these things we repressed, we pushed down. And a lot of these things we unconsciously repressed, meaning a girl is very aggressive towards men, very aggressive, and even as a jerk sometimes, but she doesn't know why or where it comes from. And then Freud might be able to point out and say, look, you've been heavily influenced by something that happened in your childhood when you were young. There's something that happened that you're still carrying with you 5, 10, 15, 20 years after the fact. Like, your father died 10 years ago, and you're still angry at him for what he did to you 30 years ago. Folks, this is crazy. Like, and when I say crazy, not that it's outrageous or unbelievable, but to have these thoughts, first of all, in 2023 is interesting. But over a century ago, you want to talk about forward thinking, you want to talk about a visionary, you want to talk about having ideas that people really looked at him and thought, yeah, you're a bit too far, buddy. Like, I mean, look, you're a medical doctor and all, but now what do you mean someone can be traumatized for over 10 years? Really? How's that possible? And Freud believed that a lot of these things that we push deep down, we repress and we want to forget. And whether we do this consciously or unconsciously, which was another thing that he coined, this idea of unconsciously, when he said, look, when your boyfriend tells you you're not good enough and you start crying a crazy amount, is it really because he told you you're not good enough, or is there other things going on? Maybe at some point in your life, your parents told you weren't good enough, and then you're hearing it from him just reconfirmed the beliefs that your parents had about you. So what else is going on here? Things that people were not consciously aware of. So Freud recognized that if we can take the things in our unconscious and make them conscious, we can alleviate our symptoms. If we could take things from the past and connect them to the present, we can alleviate our symptoms. We want to figure out the root of the problem. And if we can address the root, we can indirectly address the symptoms. And there's a lot of things that you might not even be aware of until you get to counseling, until you talk to someone about it, until you're mid-discussion and someone says, hey, John, can I point something out? Every time you talk about that terrible thing that happened to you, you laugh and you look down. Like, you say that have you noticed you do that, dude? And Tom or John's like, no, actually, I haven't. I wonder if that's a coincidence or if that means something. That I purposely avoid eye contact with you when I mention this particular phrase or this particular sentence. So Freud does all of this looking around of the unconscious and repressed memories, and he says, look, we put these negative things in a backpack. It's like heavy rocks in a backpack. And then when we get older, we carry them with us. Have you ever heard the word, when you go out on a date, look at the luggage that someone's carrying? The luggage being metaphorical for their traumas, their upbringing, their modeling, what they've seen as right and wrong in their pain. And then we carry those things into our romantic relationships, into our friendships, to work, into our hobbies, into our classrooms. And the only way to get rid of that stuff, Freud believed, was to confront it. And this thought was so out there, and it was so crazy at the time, it was so wild, that there's this part of our mind that we can't see. If we open up someone's brain, you can't point to the part that's unconscious. And yet, largely in 2023, we all recognize that, like, if I tell you, hey, there's a part of you that has unconscious motives that you're not actually aware of, most people would say, yeah, that makes sense. Like, it's not a very controversial thing to say. But at the time it was extremely controversial. Extremely. Now, Freud had two things working for him and one against him. First thing working for him was he was an old white man. Now, I know it's a controversial thing to talk about 2023 patriarchy and this and that and male privilege, but folks, 120 years ago, this was indisputable. Right? If you're a man, more power to you. If you're white, phew. Another woman may have came up with similar ideas, but because she was a woman, because of her sex, or because of someone's skin color, especially in Europe at the time, in Austria, they wouldn't have taken them as seriously as they would Dr. Freud. Not to mention, he was also a medical doctor. If some homeless dude pulls you to the side and goes, hey, did you know your dreams have meaning? Part of you might go, yeah, buddy, sure they do. But if a medical doctor, if you visit your family doctor and he's like, hey, I just want you to know that it's important to consider your dreams when talking about your diagnosis. Like, whoa, this stuff actually means something, right? And it's kind of like a logical fallacy. It's the origin fallacy, meaning where we get this information from emphasizes how likely we are to believe it, rather than judging the information or the argument in and of itself, regardless of who's telling us this. So the idea becomes, how can we take the unconscious and make it conscious? This can be done through things like free association, like dream analysis. How can we become aware of things that we aren't aware of? And if you ever meet a psychoanalyst or people who have done lots of training in psychoanalytics, they've got a plethora of different exercises and experiments that they can walk you through that are designed to do just that. Now, over the years, many different psychologists looked at psychoanalysis and they had their own interpretations of it. They had their own thoughts, they had their own modifications of what it could be, what it should be, and their own limitations. For example, three figures that were very big that stumbled upon psychoanalysis were Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and Erik Erikson. So these three gentlemen all look at Freud, and they all look at his principles and his ideas, and they go, look, Freud, what you've done with the unconscious, awesome, really great. Defense mechanisms, brilliant, man. You've outdone yourself. But do you think we could tone down all the sex? Because Freud had a lot of sex talk. And sex talk being a lot of our drive in life is sex. Now, it's down to interpretation. We don't really know what that meant. One possible hypothesis is he meant reproduction. Like, we have a drive to repopulate. We have a drive to have sex, to have a family, to be married, to have children, so we can pass on our DNA. That's one way to interpret it. Another thing that people also criticized was how long it took. Like, generally, psychoanalysis could take close to a year, if not more, to fully psychoanalyze someone, to go through their childhood, talk about their dreams, like to really get down to the core of an individual. And this led to the birth of other different psychologies. The more modernized version of psychoanalysis is called psychodynamic theory. So if you ever hear psychodynamic theory, I want you to imagine Freudian psychology, psychoanalysis, but it's been modified, it's been revamped, it's been repackaged. It's a little bit shorter, so it's faster, it doesn't take as long, and it has a greater emphasis on personality, and it's a greater emphasis on being in the present, and a little bit less emphasis on the past. Imagine it like a new update or something. It's the same form, it's just been tweaked up a little bit. So Jung, Erikson, and Adler all look at psychoanalysis and they add their own unique twist to it. I know I've said this on here before, but it's really important, folks, to recognize the words that we use that we take for granted. If I was to tell you, hey, Sarah's dad recently passed away, but she's in denial. Folks, denial came from Sigmund Freud. It was something that it was an unconscious defense mechanism. Why? If I deny it, I don't have to accept the fact that my father's dead. Because if I accept the fact that my father's dead, I have to accept all the feelings and emotions that come with it. So I will deny it, right? Just like how the first time in human history, the words extroversion and introversion were coined by Dr. Carl Jung. Now, we use a lot of different words to describe this. Some people are talkative, some people aren't. Some people are outgoing, some people aren't. But in the most widely accepted personality model in all of psychology right now is the Big Five. What is the Big Five? Do you know? Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion. We still use this word. Carl Jung passed away in like 1961. This gentleman's been dead for over 60 years and we still use his word. So if you're talking about legacy, it left its mark. So Jung had its own takes, and if you thought Freud was out there, if you thought Freud was a little crazy, a little bit of an anomaly, Jung was really out there. Like, if Freud was in the hallway, Jung was up on a tree branch when he combined his ideas of psychoanalysis with religion, specifically Christianity, with Greek mythology, with astrology. I mean, it's really out there. And his work on archetypes, and he said, look, we've got these figures, these ideas that we're going to see over and over and over again in life. For example, I want you to think about Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. I want you to think about Dumbledore in Harry Potter. I want you to think about Merlin the Wizard in Arthur, is it? King Arthur? So this idea of like the old wise wizard, we see everywhere, all the time. And it's like the same repeating template character. Old white guy with a beard. He's not the noble heroic guy, but he's not the evil guy either. He's kind of in the middle. And he said, look, these things, we see them everywhere. The twins, right? The twins that are the exact same. Fred and George in Harry Potter, Pippin and Merry in Lord of the Rings, Philly and Killy in The Hobbit. There's so many more, right? That the twins who are kind of comical, but they're also not the smartest tools in the shed. So he did a lot of emphasis on that. Alfred Adler is credited with coming up with these ideas of superiority complex, inferiority complex, undercompensation, and overcompensation. So if you've ever heard someone say things like, deep down, Ashley believes she's not enough. So because of that in her relationships, she goes above and beyond so that she can kind of fight that inner self-critic that tells her she's not enough. If you've heard of that stuff, you'd be very interested to check out the work of Dr. Alfred Adler. He was really big. And also he did a lot of research in birth order and how when you're born, if you're the first child, the middle child, the latest child, how it impacts your personality. How often have you heard someone say, oh, Billy and Gina grew up under the same roof with the same parents, yet they turned out so differently. How could that be? And the reason is they didn't. They were taught, they lived in a fundamentally different household. When Billy was born, his parents raised him a sort of way. And then when Gina, his sister, was born, folks, we know that the environment impacts the individual, but the individual also impacts the environment. So when Gina, his sister, was born, it was a different environment. Because her parents were already parents before her. Whereas when Billy entered, he was the first child. So then we see these trends of firstborn children being a little bit more conscientious, wanting to earn mom and dad's validation, wanting to be the overachievers. And then we see the second children sometimes wanting to get out of the shadow of the middle of the first child. Wanting to, just because my brother or sister did this, I'm going to do the opposite. Because I'm not just Billy's sister. I'm my own person. So he did a lot of work in that. Finally, Erik Erikson is most notably known for his work in different life stages and why we act certain ways in different life. And I know I've made videos about this before, how in adolescence it's very important we start thinking about identity versus identity confusion. Young adulthood, we start looking at intimacy versus isolation. And the thought here is that it's not that you figure out who you are by 17 and you start dating by 18. But these thoughts start to come up in your head of like, this is something important. If you pull a 9-year-old boy over and go, hey buddy, who are you? And the kid's like, I'm Timmy. And you're like, no. Who are you really? At your core. He probably won't understand what you mean. Because to a 9-year-old, thinking about things like identity and who am I and values, they're pretty simplistic. You could make a case that for an 8 or 9-year-old, the values and morals of what's wrong or right, they're essentially a mirror of their parents. Like if mom and dad say it's right, I guess it's right. Whereas we don't really start thinking like that until we hit 13, 14, 15, where we start thinking about ourselves and maybe identity and conformity. So Erikson had the wherewithal to recognize, he goes, look, psychoanalysis is interesting, but there's a lot of emphasis on the first 6 years of life. Whereas every different stage of life has its own uniqueness. Whether it's based on conformity, whether it's based on autonomy, whether it's based on independence. And these are all equally important to take into consideration. So, these are some reasons why psychoanalysis was such a big deal. The domino effect that it had on all of psychology, not to mention other psychologists who came across it, like Carl Jung, like Alfred Adler, like Erik Erikson, who all put their twist to it. I hope you know a little bit more. I hope it was entertaining. Take care, everybody, and bye-bye.